Hello. This video is on the topic of scatter plots. Scatter plots are a way to graph data and then analyze data. So to begin our scatter plot, we start by drawing a vertical and horizontal axis. All right, so you can think of a scatter plot as basically being the first quadrant of a coordinate plane, and where you have the vertical axis going up and then the horizontal axis going to the right, and they both share a common point, which would be the 0 point of our graph, usually the 0 point. All right, so a scatter plot is used to plot data that has comparing two different quantities. All right, so you'd have a quantity on your vertical axis, and it could be like a bell ringing, or it could be anything really. And then you have another quantity on your horizontal axis. And so by graphing those two quantities like an ordered pair, like a point, you can then graph a bunch of data and see if there's any correlation between the data. All right. So what do we mean by correlation? Well, let's take a look. All right, here we have some data in a scatter plot form. Notice that this first scatter plot right here, it's comparing wife's age to husband's age. And there seems to be a correlation, a positive correlation. If we were to just take a general description of this graph, doesn't it look like the data is going upward to the right? And we could draw a line that would pretty much give us a description of how the data is going. And we would call this a trend line. So we see that this trend line shows that as the husband's age is increasing, that the wife's age is also increasing. So it's basically, looks like husbands and wives' age are, for the most part, pretty close together. They're pretty close to the same number. If I was to pick, the data for a husband age 50, okay, like right in here, okay, usually their wife is pretty close to the same age, maybe a few years younger or something. We have a couple of them that are lower than average, but most of the time we're going to have a pretty consistent result for this data. Okay, so here's a generic one that would also show, a positive correlation. As one number is increasing in the horizontal direction, the other number is also increasing. So if we were to draw a trend line, what we would do is we would take a ruler and then we would try to draw the line so about half the points are above and about half are below. So maybe something like this. That would be my trend line for that graph. Okay, so those are examples of positive correlations. Or we could say positive trends. So as one is increasing, the other is also increasing. Okay, so here we have an example of a correlation that's different. You can see that this graph here, the trend line is going downward. So we see that as this quantity is increasing along the x direction, that the value in the y direction is decreasing. All right? And so here we have a real-life example of maybe something that would give a trend like this. So in this first graph, we see that as the elevation in meters increases, that the mean or the average temperature is decreasing. Now that makes sense, right? The higher you go in elevation, the colder the temperatures tend to get. And so if we were to draw a trend line for this graph, it might be something like this. So this is called a negative trend or a negative correlation, which simply means that as one value increases, the other value decreases. All right, so here we have a third example of a scatter plot. And here we notice that there doesn't seem to be a correlation. There isn't a trend for this data. The dots are all over the place. Okay, so if you're going on your graph in this direction, you could have a number that's low or high or in the middle somewhere. So here we can't see a definitive pattern like we could in the previous examples. So here we would say there is no correlation. There is no trend. All right, so if we were to plot quantities comparing two kinds of data or two different numbers of data, we would say there's no trend or no correlation here. So maybe one that we could use, oops, that was an accident. Okay, so let's look at this one. All right, now it has something here. I pulled this off the internet to give you an example, but I don't like what they have here. Citation ranking and blog ranking or something. Okay, maybe some of you know what that means. I really don't. So I'm going to give my own example of maybe something that would have no correlation, no trend. For instance, maybe this would be grade point average, GPA, and this would be shoe size. Okay, we would expect that a person's shoe size would have absolutely no bearing on their grade point average. You could have a person with a size 4 shoe that has a 4.0 GPA, but you could have a person that has a size 14 shoe that has a 2.0 GPA. So there's no trend or correlation that we could see if we were to take everyone's shoe size and compare it to their GPA. I think we'd be all over the place, just like this graph. All right? Okay, so in summary, a scatter plot is when we plot points that compare two sets of data, and we either get a positive trend, a negative trend, or we get no trend at all. Thank you for listening, and as always, read some books.